You're listening to Catalyst for Change, and my name is Jessica Huckabee, your host. I started this podcast to learn what makes people resilient after challenging events and how they've used those series of events as a catalyst for change in their life. You'll hear stories of resiliency and strength, so get ready, sit back, and be prepared to be inspired. Today on my show, I have Natalie Vecchione. She's an FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder parent advocate, homeschooler, podcaster, but most importantly, she's a wife and she's a mom. She began homeschooling 6.5 years ago when noticing how many accommodations her son, later diagnosed with FASD, needed. After his diagnosis, she began advocating for FASD by being a peer support mentor and facilitating a support group. She is certified in mental health first aid and has been a board-certified music therapist for 25 years. Recently, Natalie has volunteered as a board member and social media coordinator for several North Carolina nonprofits. In 2020, Natalie began her new adventure in the world of podcasting through producing and hosting podcasts about FASD. She became a mom on a mission with a microphone. Natalie and her husband John are co-founders of FASD Hope, LLC. The mission of FASD Hope is to provide awareness and inspiration to people whose lives have been touched by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. They live in farm country of North Carolina with their 5-year-old daughter, who just began homeschooling, and her 18-year-old son, who just graduated from homeschooling and is now proudly working as a carpentry apprentice. Natalie is thrilled to begin this new adventure of FASD Hope, LLC, and the FASD Hope podcast series. Well, thank you, Natalie, for coming on my show, Catalyst for Change, Stories of Resiliency. I'm so happy that you joined us, and I really want to hear more about your story.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Natalie Vecchione, and I am the mama of two amazing kids, both of whom were blessed to us by adoption, domestic adoption. Our son is 18 and he recently graduated from homeschool. We homeschool our kids. And he is a carpentry apprentice and he's also studying computer coding. And our son has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or an FASD. And the motivation behind our an inspiration, I should say, behind our podcast, FASD Hope, and our website, FASD Hope. We also have a 5.5-year-old daughter who is typically developing, and we have made many accommodations in our family because we have learned, especially in the past few years, our family has learned that fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are brain-based disabilities caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. So in the FASD community, we really acknowledge and accommodate that having an FASD is a brain-based injury that happens to an unborn child as a result of prenatal alcohol exposure. So our story is basically my story as a mom was parenting a child that has this brain-based disability for so many years. One specialist had suspected that he may have had fetal alcohol exposure when he was 2. But at the time, so that was about 16 years ago, we were told, oh, just put him in early intervention, he'll be fine. And it was never documented or anything like that. So whenever my husband and I would bring up our, that conversation, to any of our son's doctors or specialists, we were basically, brushed off, and just, it was kind of discredited. When we moved to North Carolina 4 years ago, we found an amazing FASD consultant, joined a parent support group, and learned that, yes, it was our son did have an FASD, and it was confirmed when he was hospitalized 3.5 years ago. And when we received that diagnosis, for us, that was our catalyst for change, because then we learned about FASDs and we learned about the science behind the damage to the brain that alcohol causes. And we learned about making accommodations, and we learned about what the characteristics are and whatnot. Earlier this year, I started podcasting, and a few months ago, my husband and I started FASD Hope, which we really consider kind of a mission for us, to bring awareness, to help inform and those families of kids, teens, adults that have an FASD, but especially to give them hope, because the statistics with having an FASD, they can be very startling.
Mm.
And we want, families and loved ones and professionals and anyone who will listen to us to know that you can have hope with an FASD. Life can be successful. However, accommodations need to be made, just like with any other brain-based diagnosis. So, and we're still in the trenches. Our son is 18 and a half. We live out in the middle of farm country in North Carolina because we knew it was best for our son, and we, are actually going to build a tiny house on our property for him so that he can have, what the term we embrace, and I'm sure your listeners are aware of it, but interdependence, so that he can be independent but still have the safety net of us, being on our property. So yeah, so we learned a lot, that the diagnosis, when we finally had it confirmed that yes, he had been prenatally exposed to alcohol, that really shifted everything, and learning about symptoms, that what we were seeing were not willful behaviors, but actually symptoms of his brain diagnosis.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It sounds like you overcame a lot of challenges regarding the fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. Is it disorder or
So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
spectrum disorder?
Fetal alcohol syndrome is one of the diagnoses under there.
Yeah.
There are like 4 to 5 diagnoses, and they're recognized by the DSM-5.
Yeah.
But you can have, depending on when alcohol was consumed during pregnancy, depending on, a lot of factors. It's a spectrum disorder, just like autism or,
Yeah.
other spectrum disorders. So yeah, FAS is part of one of the diagnoses, but that's the other thing too. We wanted to kind of help be a part of, the movement that, we kind of break the myths and the misconceptions about FASD, because a lot of folks think, oh, fetal alcohol syndrome, there's the face and everything, and actually that's a very small percentage of individuals who have an FASD. It's considered an invisible disability. About
Yeah.
90% of individuals that have prenatal alcohol exposure have no facial characteristics.
Yeah. Tell me about the other myths that are out there about this.
Absolutely. So, the first, I think the first myth that we need to dispel is in the area of prevention, that it's okay to have a glass of wine or it's okay to have a little alcohol during a pregnancy. The CDC, so many other organizations all acknowledge that there is no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy. And the other myth is that FASDs occur, only with certain populations. Now, there's a stronger prevalence in certain populations. However, FASD does not discriminate, it does not discriminate socioeconomic status. It does not discriminate culture. It happens across the board. Having an FASD means that you were exposed to alcohol, during when you were pregnant, in your birth mother or in your biological mother's womb. FASD, having an FASD can happen to anybody. So that's kind of the second myth we hope to dispel, is that, oh, well, it only happens to certain, groups. Yes, about 80% of children that are in foster care have an FASD.
80%. Wow.
80%. A large majority of individuals who have been adopted have an FASD, whether it be domestic or international. However, studies have been showing that the demographic in which there are the strongest increase of FASD is Caucasian college educated women.
Wow.
who either are married and trying to conceive or have an unplanned pregnancy. And we know that, more about 50%, I believe, is the number of unplanned pregnancies in the United States. Now,
Yeah.
whether they be, women who are married and trying to conceive, or, an unplanned pregnancy, most women do not, if the pregnancy is unplanned, most women don't know until they're probably in their second month or so.
Yeah.
And even if just a little bit of alcohol is consumed during that time, and then they realize it and they stop, the prenatal alcohol exposure has still happened.
And is it
So that,
worse in the first trimester?
well, it really just depends on a number of factors.
Mm.
In the first, actually, so the facial characteristics that many people associate with having, a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder only happen like in, I believe it's like the third week of pregnancy. It's like 6 days. So if there's alcohol consumed during that time period, then you will see the facial characteristics that are often, people think of. It actually, depending on, there are some great organizations and books that I can share with you to share with your listeners, but it really all depends on when the exposure happens and what circumstances are around the pregnancy, like prenatal care. So the exposure of the alcohol does affect certain areas at certain times of the pregnancy.
Okay.
But again, because it's a spectrum disorder, it's
Yeah.
not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
So yes, there are different characteristics for each trimester, but again, there's a number of factors into it. Yeah, I'm going to leave you some resources that you can share with your audience, that so you can learn more about that science. The book that my husband and I read, that the FASD community really embraces, as far as like the good book to start learning about FASD, is a book called Trying Differently Rather Than Harder, and it's by Diane Malbin. And she also founded the Facets, FASCETS.org, neurobehavioral training and education in working with individuals that have either an FASD or another brain-based diagnosis. So it's really what we call the neurobehavioral model, which is addressing, the fetal alcohol exposure, prenatal alcohol exposure, addressing it as a brain-based disability. And it also has behavioral symptoms and medical symptoms. And when you take that approach, which we started learning about and which we did 3 years ago, but especially in the past 2 years, it really changes. It changes so much. It's really just a game changer in the way you parent or take care of or educate someone that has a prenatal alcohol exposure. And I think the biggest myth that, we would like to address is that it's very commonly thought that, alcohol is has a lesser impact than, say, drugs or illicit drugs or prescription drugs during a pregnancy. Alcohol is actually the worst of those drugs. And it's a legal drug. Alcohol is legal. So I think a lot of people think, oh, well, okay, that's okay. Alcohol actually does more damage to the brain and to the cell structure and to the formation of, parts of the brain, especially things like working memory and mood regulation and whatnot, than any other substance, that can be consumed as a drug during pregnancy. So the fact that if we can communicate, alcohol is the worst of those drugs that can be consumed, and that will lead to a lifelong brain-based disability. That really, knowing those things really are game changers, especially, again, not only as a parent or a caregiver, but as an educator, as a professional, as anyone who works with someone who's been impacted by alcohol exposure during pregnancy.
Yeah. No, what are some of the challenges that you and your family faced because of this disorder? And how did you get through those things?
Sure. So there were many things when our son was smaller, I should say, when he was younger, the characteristics that came out were things like sensory. He had a lot of sensory seeking behaviors. He had sensory avoidance behaviors. He had delayed processing, visual processing disorder, auditory processing disorder. Another primary characteristic is dysmaturity. So acting and socially, being a lot younger than your chronological age. Things, especially executive functioning skills. So being able to carry out, plan, predict, prepare, things like that.
Yeah.
So as he got older, we saw more of the behavioral symptoms. So those, of course, affected things like school. School was probably one of the hardest challenges that we had and that most families have that parent a child that has an FASD. Our accommodation was actually we started homeschooling our son because the way alcohol affects the brain, working memory can be very poor, and there are a lot of memory problems that can happen. And it's very inconsistent. So one day, for example, our son might have been able to retrieve information that he was taught, but then the next day he couldn't. And again, that's all related to the alcohol exposure. So
Yeah.
for us, homeschooling and we were able to meet him where he was at, go at a slower pace when it came to subjects that he had a challenge in, but then, nurture the strengths in the subjects that he actually was very strong in. That's another myth too, is having a low IQ often comes with having an FASD. That is not always the case. In fact, most individuals that have an FASD have average, below average, usually have an average IQ. And again, that's all because of when the exposure happened. Education, another challenge for us was just really figuring out what symptom was, more of a mood or, an emotional social symptom versus what was an actual brain-based symptom. So, for example, with individuals that have an FASD, structure is really important. Having structure in place for the day, for the week, that kind of thing. Oftentimes, our son has his most anxiety when he doesn't know what to do next. And again,
Yeah.
that's all part of, the diagnosis. So, for us, the challenge for us, my husband and I, is okay, putting things into place so that he would have things to do to keep his brain busy, to keep his
Yeah.
mind busy in a positive way. So that's another example. And I think perhaps the biggest challenge was now planning, he's 18 now, and most 18-year-olds, they either go off to school or go off to college or work or trade school or whatnot. And for us, it's different. For us, our son lives at home. He works part-time as a carpentry apprentice. He studies carpentry through his apprenticeship teacher, just because trade school really isn't an option for him, with his learning style. He's also taking self-paced courses online in computers and coding and things like that. There is a grieving process when you have a child that has any type of disability, especially with a brain-based disability,
Yeah.
because as your child gets older, you learn that, okay, there's going to be things that are not going to happen, or they may happen much later. So, at this stage of the game with our son being 18, now it's kind of like planning for, a different future for him. And one of those accommodations was, moving out to the country, and we have a little bit of of property on our, we call it the funky farmhouse. We have a farmhouse, and then we have a couple of, we have an attached workshop and a detached workshop, and we
Oh,
plan on
nice.
renovating the detached workshop to be his tiny house.
Oh, that'll be perfect.
Yeah, yeah. And currently he lives we have an in-law suite that's above the garage. So currently has that. So
So
that's
he's
really,
independent.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, we like to use the term interdependent because
Yeah.
he is independent, but we're there when he needs us. We're
Yeah.
there, we're the safety net. And I think for anyone that has a brain-based injury, that's really a huge concept to embrace, is that you may never have the typical, but you can have interdependent, with built-in, support systems and safety net.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And now you mentioned you just got the diagnosis when he was 15 years old.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
2.5 years ago.
So
Yeah.
tell me more about that because you knew in the beginning when he was 2 that something was different with him.
Yeah.
And you just were told, okay, early intervention, everything will be
Yeah.
fine. We
And it
didn't,
wasn't. Yep.
yeah. And then I guess we
Yeah.
didn't know as much about this. Just,
No,
yeah,
honestly, most people, especially in the past, I want to say 5 to 10 years, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder has been really embraced as a spectrum disorder, not just, FAS, not just fetal alcohol syndrome. Really, we were learning as everyone was learning.
yeah,
But most folks that have an FASD have other comorbid diagnoses. They're actually up to 400 you can have
wow,
with an FASD. So our son had, as he grew older, he accumulated a lot of those, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, anxiety, depression, just the diagnoses built up,
yeah,
and whenever we would bring up the subject of, we were told that he may have been exposed to alcohol, it really honestly wasn't until we moved to North Carolina almost 4 years ago that people were like, oh yeah, okay, and people started listening, and then we were like, oh, okay, we're getting somewhere. Having that diagnosis, he was 15, and
How
it
did that
was
change? Yeah,
it changed a lot because we went from, okay, this is all mood or this is all ADHD to, okay, there's a cause behind all of this. And it
yeah,
affected everything. Our son also had other medical issues that, again, he just accumulated it, and everybody thought, all the doctors and specialists and whatnot thought they were just, okay, he has a bunch of things going on. He's
yeah.
medically challenged, when it was due to the alcohol exposure. So, yeah, when getting that diagnosis just really was a game changer, and then more so learning about the science behind the disorder. And if I'm talking to parents out there, or if I'm talking to, anyone who works with any type of, diagnosis, the better educated you are about the science behind the disorder, I
Mm.
think the better you can accommodate. That's really key. If when you meet the individual where they're at. And really, it took all these years up until, really honestly a couple of years ago for us to really embrace that. But since we have, and since we've built our support system of people who didn't have to help us, but who chose to help us because they walked the walk, they understood it, then that motivated my husband and I to start FASD Hope, and to start our podcast, and to start the website, and to get the conversation going.
And so
um,
you found a group of people that were suffering from some similar or that were experiencing not suffering, that's maybe a bad word to say, but experiencing some of the same challenges that you and your family were having.
Yes, when we moved
Good.
down here, we joined a great support group, and that's another thing I would highly recommend. If you suspect that your child has an FASD, or if you know it, I would say getting support from either support group, from professionals who know the diagnosis, and we list a lot of resources on our website, which is fasdhope.com. We list a lot of those resources, and a lot of, like, say, the state organizations and international organizations can point you to groups, in your area. I co-facilitate a group. It was in our area in North Carolina, but since COVID, we've moved to, online, and it's honestly having the support of people who know what you're going through, as a parent or a caregiver,
Yeah.
is great. And then actually, our son also belongs to, there's a wonderful organization, nonprofit called Proof Alliance, and they actually have a group for, it's a support group for teens and young adults that live with an FASD. So he actually, and they also moved, they went from, meeting locally to moving online. So he's been a part of that. And that's really been a help for him,
Oh,
is to
good.
find other young adults that have, the same diagnoses, and they may not have exactly, again, since it's a spectrum disorder, it affects everybody differently, but they
Yeah.
understand the journey. And knowing that you're not alone, I think, is probably, for us, my husband and I, for our family, we have a strong foundation in our faith. So our faith really carried us through. I have to say, our faith in God is first and foremost.
Yeah.
And, a second after our faith is, support, in from other people, from other individuals.
Yeah.
And then right along with support, I would say, educating yourself, knowing the science behind the diagnosis.
And finding that good provider, it sounds like, was really,
Yes.
really
Oh,
key for.
and that can take years,
Yeah.
honestly. I mean, and I hear stories of other parents that, they suspect their child has an FASD, and there are not many FASD diagnostic clinics in the United States. There are, and they're wonderful. They're fantastic. I've actually interviewed quite a few of the directors,
Mm.
but there are like waiting lists that are like a year long.
Oh my goodness.
Because
Yeah.
there's not enough. So I hope that, just COVID, ending or being, better under control, that people can recognize the crisis of FASD and how prevalent it is. A recent study by Philip May, who is a PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, a 2018 study, he conducted it across many different demographics. It was a very broad study. He researched different communities. It's estimated that 1 in 20 kids have an FASD.
Wow.
And that is like a really startling statistic.
Yeah, since it's unknown, people don't
Yes.
they write it off as, oh, it must be ADHD, because a
Yes.
lot of the symptoms that you're describing, it sounds like ADHD type
It does.
symptoms.
It does. And
Yeah.
or autism,
Mhm.
it is the primary characteristics, which are in that book that I mentioned, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder.
Yeah.
The primary characteristics are so strikingly similar to ADHD,
Yeah.
to ASD.
Now that we talked about all these, the things that you faced, the challenges you faced, and how you overcame those, tell me what you're looking forward to the most with your son.
Well, honestly, I am just looking forward to watching him continue to grow, because an FASD professional, Jeff Noble, who's an amazing educator in Canada, he gave he gave this analogy of FASD being like on a gravel road, versus being on a highway. So you don't travel as fast, obviously. There are many bumps in the road. It's much harder, but the journey takes you in places that you would have never gone if you were on, the neurotypical highway. So I am just looking forward to learning more about his gifts. I consider myself to be a treasure hunter, with both of my kids, my daughter, who's neurotypical, and our son, who has a brain-based diagnosis. And with him, his gifts continue to come out. Not only is he a gifted carpenter, but he's also learning now. He's a gifted, in computer coding, and he's really interested in that aspect of computers. So i'm just I'm really looking forward to just enjoying and learning more of the gifts that he has inside of him. And I'm also looking forward to, on the podcast, I talk with so many different people in so many different, walks on this journey, whether they be
Yeah.
parents or professionals. So I'm also, on that end, my parent advocate, and I'm not an expert in this. I'm just a parent with 18 years of lived experience,
Yeah.
but I'm looking forward to myself to learning more. A lot of this journey has not been trying to change our son, which we did for so many years before we learned about this diagnosis,
Yeah.
but accommodating how we are with him.
Mm.
So I'm just looking more forward to that. And yeah, and I'm looking forward to our family just continuing to grow. We have, again, my husband and I we want to help others. We realize that we were meant to be on this journey for a reason. And we're doing now what we wanted to have 5, 10 years ago, which
Yeah.
wasn't out there.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking forward to that. And my husband came up with this wonderful expression, which we actually have on our website, is that we've learned that we can't just say it's a good day or a bad day,
Yeah.
because there's just so many complex factors that make up a good day or a bad day. So my husband and I and our family, we've learned to savor the moments. If there's a moment that just is like, oh yeah, this is a great moment, we remind my husband and I remind each other, we're like, are you savoring this moment?
Yeah.
And I think that's true with any, if you're a parent of any, again, of a child with any type of diagnosis, don't think of it in terms of a year down the road or 5 years down the road or even a month. Just savor the moments when they happen.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important. That's very important. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And your journey sounds just amazing. You sound like really giving people, and I'm so glad to have you on my show. Now, can you think of anything we may not have covered today?
Again, just if you're a parent or a caregiver or any type of professional, and you suspect that a child, teen, young adult, even an adult may have an FASD, you do your, if you read the book or if you do your research or you visit, our website and look at some of the resources that we point out, then no, number one, you're not alone. And number two, the earlier the diagnosis is the most helpful, because then you can really accommodate as the child is growing. But it's never too late. And just to have hope, our that's the name of our website and our podcast is FASD Hope, because so often people hear of just, the very sad stories and the negative stories. And yes, those are out there. And yes, they happen. But there are also some good stories. And there are also stories about hope and how people have been able to, accommodate, and learn their strengths.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just want to leave on that. Just to always have hope and know that there are other people out there that are like you and that can help.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for talking to me today. And I'll make sure to put all of your information on our show notes so people can know where to go to find more information.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Catalyst for Change, and my name is Jessica Huckabee, your host. Join us next week for another story of resiliency. And please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and feel free to leave me a comment or email me at catalystforchange20@gmail.com, or on Facebook, we have a page at Catalyst for Change Resiliency.